Hello, everybody, and welcome to what we're calling the Balance Video Conversations. And each week of this series, across all the sites of Kerith Community Church, we are exploring two concepts. They might be grace and truth, or word and spirit. And these concepts might be theological practices or traditions within the Christian faith. And they are values and goals and core kind of purposes for us as a church and the way we want to live out our faith. And this week we are talking about the two concepts of being gathered and scattered as a church. Now, we're doing things a little bit differently. I'm in the studio still, but we've got remotely, we've got Dan Wells, our pastor from the Isle of Wight over on the island, and we've got Sonia Hopkin with us as well, who is our Farnborough site pastor. Usually it's just me with one other person, guys, but we've got two genius brains on it today because both of you have been preaching this message. So it's going to be really great to just hear from you both in terms of what was preached and unpack some of this content a bit further. So do you want to just kick us off by giving us a bit of a summary? Maybe Dan, if you could start us off. What's this message about and what did you share in your messages?
Yeah, so it's this idea that as the people of God, we're called to come together, and we do that in a number of different ways. We gather on Sunday mornings often, and we have a great time together, being encouraged and empowered and equipped. And then from there, we don't just stay there. We don't just come together just to be built up and filled up and just feel really good about ourselves. Actually, that is then to be sent out and to be scattered into our just daily lives. And so part of our mission of being the people of God is that actually we work with people around us on our sort of on our front lines, in our neighborhoods and our schools, our workplaces, in our retired lives if we're retired, like all of those sorts of things. And so it's this sense of I use the sort of illustration of being filled out to be poured out. And so we come together, we gather on a Sunday to receive from God, to receive from each other, but then we go out and we scatter in order to pour out what we've received on those around us. And so it's not just a selfish thing. It's not just that we receive all of this stuff and then keep it for ourselves, but actually that we're called then to share with others, which I think is really important. It's so important as followers of Jesus that we have both. We have both of those things.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Sonia, would you add anything in terms of the message that you brought and are bringing? What else was sort of shared about?
Yeah, I used quite a niche illustration, I think, in my message when I preached this online and in Farnborough. I'd noticed, it's a bit random, stay with me, a squirrel in my garden, and who kind of had gone and buried kind of these, I call them hazelnuts in my message. I've since found out they're called cobnut trees, so I'm always learning, but had gone and buried them across my lawn rather than like stash them all in his nest for the winter season. So all through this year, I've noticed these kind of buds, this like new life springing up all over my garden, which has been quite annoying and quite disruptive. But actually, we're not called to go and be annoying, but we are called to kind of go and take what we kind of, the encounter that we have with Jesus as we gather with other people, to go and take him into the places where God has us scattered. And actually we do want to disrupt like society. We do want to disrupt the culture. And our prayer is that we see kind of new life growing in those new places. So a bit niche, but my squirrel helped me with that illustration.
No, it's a helpful illustration to help us kind of see what it actually looks like. So we're looking at, something you just said then, Dan, this idea of being sort of filled up in order that we then might be poured out. Is that right? Filled up so we can be poured out. So what would you guys say would be the danger if people are kind of leaning into one or the other, right? Let's talk a little bit about that. So let's start with the gathered side of stuff. What are the dangers if there are people who will go, I'm being poured up, I'm being filled up, but the sort of scattered side of things, they don't see the importance of that, or they don't lean into that. What does that look like if that happens?
Go on, Sonia, go for it.
Do you want me to go first? I can see a few dangers. I mean, firstly, we're not then doing what we're called to do, go and make disciples of others. We're not living out that the Great Commission in the world around us. So we're not changing the landscape of where we're going. We could kind of sit in these holy huddles and have these wonderful times together. But it's not just about first, it's not just about me, is it? It's not just about like my experience with the Lord. I mean, firstly, gathering isn't just about, me anyway. It's about me with others in community. But if I just keep hold of him to myself or with other people who already follow him, how are we then changing the world around us for him? But I think also there's a danger that we can make our gatherings, like the big one. I think like at Kerith, lots of us go off to big festivals like Wildfires once a year and things like that. So whether it's the big thing like that, whether it's the Sunday gatherings, whether it's our small group gatherings, we can kind of make that almost a false idol of those things in a way if we're not careful. Not that do you know what I mean? Like if we're not careful, we're loving the gathering more than the one who we're gathering for.
That's great.
And that's not what we're called to do. We're called to worship him, and we worship him through every area of our life, not just through song at 10:30 on a Sunday morning. We worship him in our everyday, ordinary life. We read in scripture. So yeah, it's got to impact the rest of the world. Otherwise it feels a bit self-centered, really.
So how about you, Dan? Anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's really helpful. I think, it's that danger of becoming a cozy Christian club, isn't it? Like, it's just that sense of just, it's quite nice. It's quite easy. Like there's, it can be quite lovely to come together on a Sunday and have coffee and worship Jesus together. And that's really lovely. But, James writes in his letter, what is faith without works, and actually there needs to be an outworking of our faith. If it just looks like, just coming together and hanging out in a cozy Christian bubble or whatever, then there's something really missing from our faith. Faith always leads to work and to the outworking of our faith, I think. And so that's I think really important.
Yeah.
I'm reminded that somebody told me once that there's no word for the word spiritual in the Old Testament, and that's because in sort of Jewish culture there wasn't this kind of secular sacred divide that we talk about. This kind of like, you've got your church life, which is great and comfortable, and then you've got this completely separate thing, and there's no word in. It's like, we see in the way that in Jewish history that actually there was no divide in that it was all together, whether you were gathered or scattered. And yes, that's a really great point. I love what you were saying there, guys. So let's look at the other side of things then. So and I've got a question about where we're at in today's world actually around this as well. But what would you say about what are the dangers if we go, gathering at church isn't important. Those gatherings, we don't need them. It's all about what we do outside and blah, blah, blah. What are the dangers if we live like that? What could happen then?
Yeah, I think it's hard, isn't it? I think there is that real sense of looking out for number one, isn't there? That is, we just see everywhere in the world, don't we, at the moment? And it's really easy to think of faith like that as well sometimes. To think, Jesus is my own personal saviour, and that's all I need to think about. I don't need to worry about anyone else. We've even talked in the past about things like, we worship to an audience of one, and that is true. Like, the only person that we worship is Jesus. And so when we come together on a Sunday, it's not about, performing in front of people or alongside people. It's about worshiping Jesus. But actually, I think there's something about being part of the family of God, is that we do gather. That actually doing faith on your own is really hard, and you need that equipping and empowering. There's something missing if we just try to do things on our own. And I know there's a real temptation for many people to who have either struggled with church or fallen out with people in church or been hurt by church in the past or faith or whatever. Like, there's a real temptation to say, oh, you know what, I'm not gonna get involved in any of that. It's too hard. It's too painful. It's too broken. We see so much brokenness in the church, don't we? And we're not trying to say it's perfect, but there is something really important about gathering. I was really struck by a Francis Chan talk recently, where he talks about Ephesians 2, where Paul is writing to the church in Ephesus, and and he's encouraging them that although they are Gentiles, they are now being made one with the rest of God's chosen people. And there's this bit in Ephesians 2 verse 22. It says, "And in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit." And what Francis Chan was saying is that actually, as the church, it's easy for us to think that God dwells in me, but actually in that verse he's saying he dwells in us. He dwells in the fullness of his temple, which is the body of Christ, like the whole of the church. Mm. And there's me and Sonia were chatting earlier, and we're just saying how it's easy to place too little of importance on the gathering, because we want to say, actually, you can meet Jesus in your home, you can pray to him all the time, he's always with you, and that's all really true. But actually there is real significance in gathering together as the church and focusing our attention on Jesus together and encountering Jesus together. I think that's how we're built. I think that's how God made us to be a family, to go on this mission, not individually, not on our own, but together. I think that's just really important.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Sonia, what else?
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about, like the analogy used of we're the body of Christ and we're all made up of different parts. And I was just thinking when you were talking there, Dan, because I didn't really go, when I preached this, I didn't really go into the whole, I talked about lots of the different reasons why people find it hard to gather. And there are some really genuine reasons. And another one of those genuine reasons that I didn't talk about was this whole thing around church hurt. And lots of us have experienced that. I've experienced that. Lots of us have. And when it comes to the body of Christ, I think I've often kind of used that in thinking of, this person does this thing to serve and this person does this thing. But actually, if you think about a body, the body needs each other's parts, not just to function in terms of like serving and making church, making gatherings happening. Actually, when one part of your body is injured or hurt, often other, I'm not a scientist. There's going to be all these doctors watching this kind of telling me that I'm saying the wrong thing. But the white blood cells come and attack that. I think it's that way around. We know that our body works hard to compensate when there's a part of our body hurt. So we need the body. We need the body is what I'm saying. We need the people around us. And I know on a personal level, I'm so encouraged whenever I gather with other believers, because it helps. We help one another. It's not just about my experience with Jesus in that moment. It's about our collective experience. And I come away encouraged and inspired and built up. And I just learn so much from other believers. So the body, it's just so important. If we're just scattered out there on our own, it's quite isolating, I think.
Yeah,
it's really good.
Yeah,
I think it's easy, isn't it, sometimes to when we look at gathering, to look at it from our own, like what I'm receiving, to be, often might hear comments, things like, I didn't really get anything out of the worship today, or the opposite, or like, the worship was so good, I loved the worship today, or, those sorts of things. But actually, when we gather, it's never really about us. It's about Jesus, and it's about giving of ourselves. It's about what we can bring. And I think, I've sort of been thinking about it like this, that when we gather, we gather to connect with God and connect with others, to empower, equip, and encourage each other. And then when we scatter, we help others connect with God for salvation and restoration. And I think, it's easy to look at the gathering of, what can I receive? What am I getting out of this? And, there is, we do hope that people come together and are filled up. Like, that is obviously a good thing. That's an important thing. But also it's, what can I bring? What's the unique gift that God has put in me that I can bring to this family that God's called me to be part of? And I think there's something really powerful about having that shift of attitude when we gather together. Yeah.
As recently Heather Pocock interviewed Gerald Sitzer, and if anyone who's watching this, or if you haven't watched it, then head on to the YouTube channel and watch this interview. But one thing he talked about is, in his story, he's been through some really hard, unimaginable stuff in his life. But he was saying there was a season where he would go to church and almost like the faith of the rest of the congregation would carry him through. And there's something about that beautiful dynamic, isn't there? Like you're both saying, of actually we encourage each other and we build each other up, and we need a whole collection of people. In fact, we need everybody to come to church with the mentality of, what can I bring to somebody? What can I give here, and it could be because there will be days when you just can't do that, when you're just not in the space to be able to do that, but the gathering itself will kind of cover your back, kind of thing. So it's really, really helpful hearing that from you guys. I've got a bit of a question, really, I guess, to think from your experiences now, from your lives, this idea of gathered and scattered. I'm noticing throughout this series that with all the different pairings we've got, people tend to identify more with one and the other, and they tend to have a preference to one or the other and things like that. For you, what's your journey's been like when it comes to the gathered church and the scattered church? What does it look like in your lives and in comparison to now, and has that changed, all that kind of stuff? I'd love to hear that from you.
I was telling Dan earlier when we were chatting that I grew up in church with I've been going to church, I've been going to gatherings since I was in the womb, basically, and but I remember being a child, and my expression of church that I was part of, you'd have a little card. I'm old enough to remember, you'd get a stamp card and someone would put a little star stamp every time you went to church, and at the end of the year, if you'd been enough, you'd get a prize. And it was kind of this like sense of like, and if you're not careful, that was rooted in the best of intentions, of course, but if you're not careful, that can kind of like drift into legalism and kind of going to church out of a sense of duty. And I think there were times in my life where that's what I was doing. But actually, like we read in like Acts 2, when they're, the fellowship of the believers, they're devoted. It says that's the first, they're devoted. And so moving from like a position of duty to devotion, I think is great, because actually there are seasons in your life where you don't feel like turning up. And so there maybe feels like a sense of duty, but actually, like, even in those seasons, if it's flowing from a devotion to Jesus and a devotion to the community that you're with, God does something powerful in those moments and in those spaces. So I think for me, it's just been ground into me from, as I say, from day one, kind of like you turn up, you go. But at some point it becomes your own choice and your own decision to. And I am not a natural evangelist in the way some people are. But I've been really challenged, particularly in recent years, to really lean into, not just sit in my safe space of what I find, let's be honest, I'm a pastor. So a lot of my work, a lot of my week, a lot of my work is about creating these gatherings and creating spaces for people to gather. So I have to make sure that I don't just sit in that comfy place myself, but I'm not just challenging the congregation, but I'm challenging myself to turn up in those spaces, those scattered spaces. For me, my scattered workplace is a church. So it's not, I don't have that opportunity to share with my colleagues about God in a fresh way, because I'm walking with him. Already, you already know him. So I've got to intentionally seek out those spaces. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's a long-winded way of saying the scattered stuff is the stuff that I've needed to lean in and press in and be bolder in bringing Jesus into those scattered spaces. Yeah,
okay. Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think I'd probably affiliate myself similarly, having worked at church a long time, that, being intentional about creating those spaces. Yeah, for sure. What about you, Dan?
Yeah, really similar actually. Yeah, grew up going to church. I like that picture of going to church in the womb. It's the same for me, really. I guess similarly worked for church or church organisations for a long time, and so find that scatteredness probably the harder of the two. Certainly the one that doesn't happen so incidentally. Have to be much more intentional about leaning into those sort of scattered spaces. And I think that one of the things that I'm quite good at is hiding. Like even in social settings and things, I'm quite good at sort of just being kind of quiet and keeping myself to myself, sort of thing. And I think as I'm reminded of these things, I remind myself to be more open to just being relational with people, getting to know people more, and playing football with people during the week, and then just hanging around for a little bit longer at the end, rather than just like, right, I'm off, see you later. Just being a bit slower at getting ready to leave, and those sorts of things. Or at the school gate, just getting there a bit earlier, or just leaving a bit more slowly, sort of thing. Just to I guess gradually build those relationships and things as well. which certainly wouldn't be my my instinct to do. So yeah, trying to be faithful to that, but I don't find that easy at all. So yes, certainly something that I'm wanting to grow in, and I'm inspired by others who are much more natural at it. So yes, a good challenge, I think.
And that's a good point for almost outside of the fact of you working at church and for Christian organisations and things. Actually, the majority of us will be in places where we're rushing from one thing to the next thing, aren't we? And so that challenge to I guess slow down and have that breathing space to be able to connect to other people and what in whatever way lean into stuff that God has in store for us, rather than being like next meeting or next thing I've got to go to or next of my kids or whatever. It's that kind of leaning into that space is a really good piece of advice. I appreciate that. So I guess I'd love to ask a question around the gathered side of stuff. I don't know about what your guys' opinion around this would be, but would you say there is maybe a trend happening in our society today around people who maybe would consider themselves Christian, who would go, the gathered church doesn't matter, we don't need to do that, and if there's people who are in that place where they feel like uninspired by the gathering of the church and feel like it's not worth it, what's the point, that kind of thing, what would your kind of application be for those people who maybe they're wanting to kind of engage more, they're wanting to kind of see its purpose and value, but they're not feeling that? What do you say to those people?
I think there's lots of different expressions of how to gather. And maybe people have rejected a certain style or type of gathering.
Yeah.
And they've fallen into the trap of rejecting gathering, full stop. Does that make sense? So maybe there have been disillusioned with a certain kind of church expression, or maybe they've, for lots of different reasons, they've chosen something different. I would say to those people, don't reject. Is it like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater? Like, don't reject gathering, full stop, because the certain expression of gathering that you once loved, maybe you've changed your mind on, or you've just, because gathering, what's important, in the book of Acts, when we read about the early church, it didn't look like our church looks on a Sunday morning, or necessarily our small group gatherings, or whatever it looks like. I'd just say gather with other believers. It doesn't have to look, we obviously feel like the way that we gather is a great way, otherwise we wouldn't do it this way. But I think the world has changed over the last few years, and throw in a pandemic where everybody had to completely reassess what that looks like. There was a season when we were all gathering like this online. That was all we were doing, and for some people that is a necessity for the season of life that they're in. But it's very easy to fall into the trap of just not gathering at all. So I just urge people to remember, gather, yes, because it's good for you, but to gathering is not just about one person, otherwise it's not called a gathering. It's about multiple people. So it's, as we said earlier, like it's about what you can bring. Turn around the view of, oh, I don't like that, or I don't get anything out of that. Actually, maybe it's not. I mean, we know it's not about us, it's about Jesus, but also it's about the other people who are wanting to know Jesus as well. So, flip your thinking about what I like and dislike, and actually switch it around a bit. But to gather is a good thing.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Dan?
Not massively. I guess relationships are hard, aren't they? In all relationships, there's going to be some sort of sadness, some sort of pain. That's just the reality of life. And whether that's between two people or 200 people, there's going to be some brokenness in there, because there's brokenness in all of us. And what's frustrating is that the church should be better at grace than it is. And so I think we sometimes can hold the church to a really high standard, which it should be, but we also need to have grace for each other in that. So where there has been struggles in the past, moving towards that conflict and trying to deal with it with grace and mercy and kindness, hopefully will be helpful. In some situations there is real brokenness that is toxic and actually needs to be turned away from, and that's really important too. And where that's happened, it's really important to find help and support in really, really safe people. So just encourage you to do that if that's something that you've struggled with in the past. Then please don't go back to that church and on your own. Please make sure that you're doing what's safe and going to be healthy for you going forwards. That's really important. But I would encourage people, where it's not that sort of abuse or anything like that there can be restoration, and that not all churches are the same. There is all churches are different, in fact, and there may be a better fit for some than others, and that's okay. I think that's partly why there is such a broad range of what the church looks like. There are different styles, there are different approaches. Like Sonia said, there are many different sorts of gatherings, like throughout the church, whether that's between a group of 3 or 20 or 300 or whatever, or meeting in Starbucks on a Sunday afternoon, or messy church, or in a gathering of 200 in an auditorium on a Sunday morning. Like, that's okay. Like, there's space for difference and diversity in what church looks like. But like Sonia says, I think prioritizing gathering and seeking Jesus alongside others will do you good. Yeah,
that's excellent. Great. So that's some really clear advice, wisdom, support there for people in that situation. So thank you too. I guess one last question would be the other side of the coin now. So those people who are, I don't know, maybe they love the gathering of church, and for them that's like the best bit of their week is that Sunday morning or whenever their group gathers. But then they leave that gathering and they find maybe the rest of their day to day, the rest of their weeks, whether it's at work or whatever it is they're responsible for, involved in, and they don't feel purpose in it. They feel like, what's the point? This feels like just nothing, meaningless almost. What help and advice and thoughts have you got for those people?
It's good. It's a really great question. I came across this quote recently from a guy whose name I can't really pronounce, but I think it's like Frederick Buechner, something like that. And he says this, God's like talking about God's calling on your life. He says, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. I love that. I think that's so good. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Because it's easy, isn't it, to either do something that's really great for me and makes me feel really great, but doesn't really have any great impact on the world around me. And that's a bit narcissistic, I think. Or you can do something that is, that really meets the need of the world's deep hunger, the brokenness in the world, but without that overlapping with my deep gladness, then I will just burn out. And finding that place where those two come together can be really difficult to find, but also hugely fulfilling and have a huge impact. So I guess that's one thing, is to consider what that might look like in your life. And that will look different for everyone, right? Like, for some, that will mean just loving the people that you're around in your day to day, in your workplace, in a job that you enjoy, and just finding ways to love those people and demonstrate what Jesus is like to those people around you. For others, it might mean a huge shift and like starting a charity or going and working abroad somewhere to do something totally different in order to find that. But I guess I'd encourage you to explore it. Don't be afraid to not explore that. Like, don't just settle for something if actually you feel like maybe God's stirring something in you. I guess that would be my encouragement. Yeah.
Really good. Yeah.
I guess I'd circle back to my squirrel in terms of like going and I need to name this squirrel. He's become famous.
Yeah.
Cedric the squirrel has gone around like as I said, disrupting, and just that reminder, we're called to do that. Jesus, the light of the world, told us we are the light of the world as well. Like, I'm just reading it now. Where is it? You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people put a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. You know, if we're so passionate about the gathering and coming to worship our amazing God and worship Jesus together, then we need to take his word seriously. And we need to do what he says. And we need to go scatter. And we need to go and shine his light. That might be sharing him in terms of like speaking about our own story and how he's changed our lives, sharing him with people in that way. Sometimes it's just turning up and being his hands and feet and being like him in the places where he has us. And yeah, I just think if we just keep it to ourselves, then we're not living in the fullness of what he wants for us and what he wants for the world around us. So we're called to disrupt the places where he's got us.
Really good. Excellent. Oh, you two, thank you so much. I'm seeing the time, and we're short on time, so I have to wrap up the conversation now. But thank you both for your messages, and thank you for the stuff that you've been sharing today. So helpful. I'm sure it's going to be really helpful for everybody who's been watching this. If you found it helpful, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear, if you're going to start taking risks such as Dan's suggesting here, go for it. Let us know what they are. And also just sort of a heads up, if you haven't heard Dan or Sonia's message, you can check them out on the Kerith Isle of Wight podcast and the Kerith Farnborough podcast. Also, Sonia, you recorded yours for online, didn't you? So we've got a video of that here on the Kerith YouTube channel as well. And also just a reminder that for all of these weeks in the series, we've got these conversations about these different concepts. And you can find all of those conversations as well as all the messages on kerith.church/balance. And you can get all the different things you can there and watch these in your own time. But thanks again, guys. Really appreciate your time. And thanks for watching, everybody. And we'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.